It is somewhat puzzling, I think, that you can have 100% certainty about the weapons of mass destruction's existence and zero certainty about where they are.
After all the fervor for invading over WMDs, the hunt was as haphazard as the intelligence catastrophe. Thrown together as if it was an afterthought, almost 3 months into the war, no one seemed to be in charge of the search. Hubris. During a meeting with top U.S. commanders in June 2003, Bush demanded to know who was in charge of the WMD search. He turned to Paul Bremer, his viceroy in Iraq, and asked if it was his job to find the weapons. No, said Bremer. Bush put the same question to General Tommy Franks. The general said the WMD hunt was not his responsibility. Then who? An exasperated Bush exclaimed. After they came up empty on finding any WMDs, former UN Chief Weapons Inspector David Kay was brought in to take over the search in June 2003. Kay had a whole new approach in mind, but even the most perfected methods are no match for the futility of looking for something that isn't there. 6 months later, Kay resigned in January 2004, concluding that there were no WMD stockpiles. The Bush administration had no intention of conceding that point in an election year. Mother Jones Magazine, January 15, 2004. 6 months after the end of major combat in Iraq, the United States has spent $300 million trying to find banned weapons in Iraq, and President Bush was seeking another $600 million more to extend the search. I predicted that they would call off the search soon after the 2004 election, and I even wrote a poem about it. 2 months after Bush was reelected, the search was terminated.
You haven't replied to my basic argument that if all these others thought Saddam had WMD and Bush thought Saddam had WMD, then if Bush was lying about these, weren't these others also lying? Clearly neither they nor Bush were lying, because if you believe what you are saying, it's not a lie, even if it's wrong. And I do think Saddam had WMD, and I think he aided terrorists, so I must be a liar too.
The question comes down to whether or not you're basing your belief on something in the realm of reason, not some fail-safe fantasy that allows you to believe whatever you want. Refusing to open your eyes to the evidence is intellectually dishonest at minimum, so whether you're blatantly lying or not, you're most certainly not arguing in the interest of truth. And that truth can be easily ascertained by looking at the machinery behind the scenes. Add in some analysis of the systematic obfuscation from both parties, and every piece of the puzzle fits. The Democrats are stigmatized as weak on defense, so before 9/11, they talked tough on Iraq because it didn't cost them anything to do so, and afterward, they were too scared not to, which Tom Daschle point-blank admits to in the following clip.
We were 2 months out from an election, and no one, Republican, Democrat, Independent, ever wants to be viewed as weak on national security.
The sheer casualness of that statement astounds me, and it shows how these people have sold their souls to doctrines of dishonesty. They have compromised the truth so many times that it just becomes an accepted part of the job.
I'm not surprised at all that there is disagreement in the intelligence community. There are a lot of people involved there. The higher level officials at these agencies are responsible to follow a process and draw the best conclusions they can. In other words, they make a case. That case will necessarily include some things and exclude some things. The bottom line is a general assessment of danger. Sometimes that danger will be overestimated and sometimes underestimated.
That's an incredibly Pollyannish viewpoint. Even a cursory look at the evidence smacks of political hackery. So it's ludicrous to suggest that all these agencies were acting in good faith. My professor friend has an intellect that's off the charts, and he's pretty objective on the whole. But his perception was excessively predicated on Powell's reputation. He was far from alone. Washington Post, February 6, 2003. The evidence Powell presented to the United Nations, some of it circumstantial, some of it absolutely bone-chilling in its detail, had to prove to anyone that Iraq had not only not accounted for its weapons of mass destruction, but without a doubt still retains them. Only a fool, or possibly a Frenchman, could conclude otherwise. The clincher was the totality of the material and the fact that Powell himself had presented it. In this case, the messenger may have been more important than the message. First off, I find it childish that people feel the need to mock France in order to make their point. Secondly, I was a fan of Powell at the time, but he didn't appear to be someone who believed what he was saying. It is the fool who takes someone's words at face value when they are strikingly out of sync with the situation. My suspicions were partly based on the totality of the times, and that we seemed to be in a big rush to war without evidence in proportion to the pace to get there. My instincts were corroborated by the record of doctored intelligence as well as Powell's own passing thoughts. Hubris. Sometime in the days before the UN speech, Senator Joe Biden called Powell. Referring to Powell's UN presentation, Biden cautioned him, "Don't speak to anything you don't know about. That is, don't overstate the evidence." There was silence at the other end. Then Powell replied, "Someday when we're both out of office, we'll have a cup of coffee and I'll tell you why." Why what? Powell didn't explain, but Biden took the remark to mean that Powell was going to present a case about which he had his doubts.
Powell walked into my office, and without so much as a fare-thee-well, he walked over to the window and he said, "I wonder what will happen when we put 500,000 troops into Iraq and comb the country from one end to the other and find nothing." And he turned around and walked back in his office. And I wrote that down on my calendar, as close to verbatim as I could, because I thought that was a profound statement coming from the Secretary of State, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
While the quotes from both Wilkerson and Biden are telling as to Powell's reservations, true clarity is in connecting the dots between the people and the process.
The administration made statements which I can only describe as dishonest. Well, the conclusion that I ultimately came to was that this was a matter of, as I've called it, faith-based intelligence. They were cherry-picking the information that we provided to use whatever pieces of it that fit their overall interpretation. And worse than that, they were dropping qualifiers and distorting some of the information that we provided to make it seem more alarmist and more dangerous than the information that we were giving them.
Greg Thielman should know. He had been Powell's own chief of intelligence when it came to Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. Greg Thielman was a Foreign Service officer for 25 years. His last job at the State Department was acting director of the Office of Strategic Proliferation and Military Affairs, responsible for analyzing the Iraqi weapons threat for Secretary Powell. You and your staff had the highest security clearances.
That's right.
And you saw virtually everything.
That's right.
Whether it came into the CIA or the Defense Department, it all came through your office sooner or later.
Yes.
The New Yorker, August 27, 2003, Kenneth Pollack, a former national security expert on Iraq who generally supported the war, said that what the Bush people did was dismantle the existing filtering process that for 50 years had been preventing policymakers from getting bad information. They created stovepipes to get the information they wanted directly to the top leadership. In every direction, it's painfully obvious what the White House was up to. The trumping of centrifuge scientists by unqualified analysts of the CIA, the repetitive bypassing of protocol in the intelligence process, and even the creation of a shadow intelligence shop at the Pentagon called the Office of Special Plans, OSP for short.
That office was largely invisible to us in the intelligence community because they didn't play in the normal bureaucratic process of making intelligence assessments and reporting on those assessments.
What did you understand that office to be about?
I'm still trying to figure out what that office was about. The office wasn't big enough for them to really have the expertise in-house, and the mere creation of the office was odd since the Secretary of Defense had the entire Defense Intelligence Agency at his disposal. So it's a little mysterious what exactly they were doing.
A key player in the Office of Special Plans was Douglas Feith, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Feith's aversion to fact can be easily ascertained on two primary points: the aluminum tubes and OSP's reliance on Iraqi exile Ahmed Chalabi. In an October 2003 interview with Liz Jackson, who conducted the Spinning the Tubes documentary for Australia's Four Corners program, Feith was asked about President Bush's September 12, 2002 speech at the UN, as to why no indication was given that there was any controversy about the tubes. Feith replied, "There are many people who believe that the tubes are for rotors. The people who are experts in these things said that while it might be theoretically possible that the tubes were for rockets, the tubes were so finely milled that you would be spending something like 50 times the price of ordinary sheathing. So that suggested that their rocket theory was not very credible." Notice how he turned the entire issue around to casually claim the exact opposite of reality even 7 months after the war started. Perhaps the most telling moment in that interview was when Feith said, "Some people took one view, some people took another." Once again with the false equivalence of experts that was so craftily perpetrated by Powell. As for that mathematical absurdity about 50 times the price, the tightened tolerance has added just a few extra dollars per tube. The sheer sloppiness in his answers alone should speak volumes about Feist's integrity, and the more you look, the worse it gets. Feist's office was heavily involved in preparing material for the Secretary of State's UN speech, providing him with a 25-page script on Saddam's purported connections to terrorists. After all that the Secretary was willing to swallow, it should be incredibly revealing that he refused to accept all but a few of Feist's assertions. Hubris. After Powell reviewed the new terrorism section, he pulled his chief of staff, Wilkerson, off to the side and said, "I'm not reading this. This is crazy." The script, Wilkerson remembered, was a genealogy, the strung together connections and associations that were incomprehensible and possibly meaningless.
With all due respect to that whole line of inquiry, the people in the U.S. government are serious people, and they have important responsibilities, and they want good information, as good as possible, on which to base their policy. And so this entire line of inquiry that suggests that we're asking to corrupt the information is just really, I think, the result of some overheated minds interested in conspiracy mongering.
Feist acts like he's a bastion of integrity in defense of his folly, coolly claiming that everything out of his office was above board. Do you really think that you can trust someone so abundantly inexact on the aluminum tubes, the most clear-cut truth of all the intelligence? Feist defends himself as if his record was wiped from the face of the earth. But the ultimate answer to his credibility is buried in the history of his activities and that of his associates. And the one that binds them all is Ahmed Chalabi. Chris Wallace captured Chalabi best on Fox News Sunday on May 23, 2004. Why is it that over the years across international borders, you are accused again and again of being a crook, of being a con man? Like his devout follower Feist, he brushed off the question like it was lent on his shoulder. How does a convicted embezzler who was discredited by the CIA for his fiasco and fraud throughout the 90s end up being a guest of honor sitting behind First Lady Laura Bush at the 2004 State of the Union? In fairness to the president, he did not personally invite Chalabi, but that's hardly the point, since he surrounded himself with the people who did. CooperativeResearch.org, April 9, 1992. After a 2-year investigation, Ahmed Chalabi is convicted in absentia and sentenced by a Jordanian military court to 22 years of hard labor in order to return $230 million in embezzled funds from his crimes connected with the Petra Bank. The 223-page verdict charges Chalabi with 31 counts of embezzlement, theft, forgery, currency speculation, making false statements, and making millions of dollars in bad loans to himself, to his friends, and to his family's other financial enterprises in Lebanon and Switzerland. None of that mattered to anyone in the cabal around Bush. The Iraqi exile was an administration favorite and a conduit to Iraqi defectors, and he had a crystal clear motive to remove Saddam. A coup d'etat in Iraq in 1958 ousted Chalabi's extremely wealthy and well-connected family. Arrows of the Night is a wonderful book about Chalabi. Quite a fascinating read regardless of his shady side. He didn't come out of nowhere. His influence on American foreign policy predates President Bush by nearly a decade. The New Yorker magazine, May 29, 2004. Between 1992 and the raid on Chalabi's home, the U.S. government funneled more than $100 million to Chalabi's Iraqi National Congress. The current Bush administration gave the group at least $39 million. Vincent Conestraro, a former CIA counterterrorism specialist, told me, "With Chalabi, we paid to fool ourselves. It's horrible. At other times, it might be funny, but a lot of people are dead as a result of this. It's reprehensible." Hubris. The entire Chalabi effort, CIA operative John McGuire concluded, was a sham. In January 1996, an indignant McGuire confronted Chalabi in a meeting in London and demanded an accounting of the agency's funds. "You've been lying to us," he told him. "You've been screwing us." McGuire got so furious, he told Chalabi if he ever saw him walking down the street in London, he would swerve his car onto the sidewalk and mow him down. The Daily Telegraph, London, February 19, 2004. Mr. Chalabi, by far the most effective anti-Saddam lobbyist in Washington, shrugged off charges that he had deliberately misled U.S. intelligence. "We are heroes in air. As far as I'm concerned, we've been entirely successful. Saddam is gone and the Americans are in Baghdad. What was said before is not important."
Many people that supported the war no longer do.
Yes.
They feel that they were suckered.
Yes, probably.
They say so.
Okay. I mean, I don't, I'm not disputing.
Well, I mean, half the people now feel that the war wasn't justified on the grounds that it was argued for.
Okay.
Do you feel any discomfort with that?
No.
Many have gleefully cited the reports by the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Rob Silverman Commission as ironclad proof that no politicization took place. One of the most insightful counters to that claim comes from former National Intelligence Officer Powell Pillar. Any intelligence analyst would be reluctant to make the damning admission that his paper had been politicized. And because in my experience, the great majority of cases of actual politicization, successful politicization, are invariably subtle. Rob Silverman report. In sum, there was no politicization of the intelligence product around Iraq. Poor tradecraft, exacerbated by poor management, contributed to the erroneous assessments of Iraq's WMD programs. These problems were further exacerbated by the reluctance of intelligence community management to foster and consider dissenting views. WinPac analysts described an environment in which managers rewarded judgments that fit the consensus that Iraq had active WMD programs and discouraged those that did not. That they managed to acknowledge that atmosphere and still assert that no politicization took place is a stupefying feat of psychological gymnastics. Slate Magazine, April 5th, 2005. Co-chairman Chuck Robb and his colleagues have a trick that allows them to deny the obvious with a straight face. They rely heavily on the CIA's definition of politicization. Alteration of analytical judgments under pressure to reach a particular conclusion. Can torturing a definition violate the Geneva Convention? If an analyst loads the dice so that his boss can tell the president that evidence of Iraqi WMD is a slam dunk, that's not politicization. If an analyst tilts to the wrong side of a factual question in hopes of increasing funding for his division, that's not politicization. Inside this legalistic boundary, it only counts as a politicization if a policymaker explicitly demands that an analyst change his views to produce a desired result. The fall of the House of Bush. For the vice president to be meeting with analysts, that was a real red flag, said one State Department official. It was so unusual. It was clear that people were being leaned on. Usually, if a high-ranking official wants information, it gets tasked out through the appropriate channels. It was highly unusual to lock these people in a room and keep pressing. It crossed the line between intellectual inquiry and not accepting the real answer. Together, Cheney and Scooter Libby made about 10 visits to CIA headquarters in Langley, a highly irregular occurrence. I was at the CIA for 24 years, said former CIA analyst Melvin Goodman. The only time a vice president came to the CIA building was for a ceremony, to cut a ribbon, to stand on the stage, not to harangue analysts about finished intelligence. Isn't it curious that Cheney and Libby spent so much time at the CIA, but didn't bother talking to the centrifuge scientists on the tubes? Russ Hoyle's excellent book crystallized that question even more. A spokesman for Cheney claimed that the vice president didn't know about the internal debate within the intelligence community until a 2002 National Intelligence Estimate was published on October 1st. The notion that Cheney, a meticulous and aggressive investigator, could have been in the dark about the DOE's view on the tubes strains credulity. Identifying deception revolves around the observation of behavioral patterns. The following interview excerpts typify how the dishonest will deflect, evade, dismiss, and redirect out of desperation. Ask the right questions, and they will dig themselves into a hole every single time. Unfortunately, the journalist didn't ask any questions that demand specificity, which left the door wide open for absurdly obfuscated answers. The weapons inspectors have found no evidence of centrifuges. Do you now accept that these tubes are almost certainly for artillery rockets and not nuclear weapons?
George, what you know today can affect what you do tomorrow, but not what you did yesterday.
Well, I'm asking about today.
I stand by the correctness of the decision to take seriously an intelligent assessment that Saddam Hussein would likely have a nuclear weapon by the end of the decade if he didn't do something.
That's not precisely what I'm asking. Do you accept today that these tubes were likely for rockets and not nuclear weapons?
As I understand it, people are still debating this. I'm sure they will continue to debate it.
And you believed it was true at the time?
Yes, so did they. They shouldn't have. I mean, there were a lot of people in the agency, in the community, that knew some of this information wasn't, as solid as it was being presented to me.
Your own State Department intelligence agency had a real caveat about the use of the aluminum tubes. They did not think they could be used for nuclear centrifuges, and yet you put forth that testimony.
There was a big debate about the aluminum tubes. CIA was absolutely convinced that they were for centrifuges. Department of Energy, IAEA, others, and some of my people in the State Department said, "We're not sure. We think they probably could be used for rocket bodies." We challenged that repeatedly, and the CIA kept coming up with technical reasons why they had to be for centrifuges.
Yeah, except that none of them made any sense. In that bit about his people at the Intelligence Bureau, INR said nothing of the kind. I really liked Tim Russert, and I regularly watched Meet the Press before he passed away. But how is it possible that a journalist of his caliber didn't have a multitude of questions lined up on this topic by 2007? Incredibly, Russert moved on without probing Powell's answers in the slightest. Colin Powell brought credibility to a case woven out of whole cloth. Yet to this day, he is heralded as a statesman.
Blame Colin Powell for believing that and still giving that speech.
Right.
And now, he's seen as a wise man, and the president courts him, and, networks court him, and we pay a lot of attention. But, he knew when he took the job that he was there to be a front for these guys, and he served dutifully as that front.
You think he knew that? I still think I'm going to defend him because I like him.
Yes,
but
he's likable.
He was a military guy thinking his job was to salute.
Mr. Matthews, with that attitude, you have no business hosting a show called Hardball. The secretary is essential to the entire charade, and yet you give Powell a pass because of your fondness for him? Coddling Colin Powell is precisely the kind of thinking that got us into this mess in the first place. This concludes Act 3.
Silver wings upon their chests. These are men, America's best. 100 men will test today, but only 3